May 1945. A makeshift prisoner camp somewhere in Bavaria, southern Germany. A group of German women sit pressed against a wooden fence. Their eyes are wide. Their bodies are frozen. They barely dare to breathe. 30 feet away, a line of dogs paces back and forth. German Shepherds, Dobermans, large, muscular animals with sharp eyes and powerful jaws. They move with purpose, controlled by soldiers holding leather leashes. The women have been told stories about these dogs, horrible stories. They believe these animals are trained to attack, to hunt, to punish. One of the dogs stops walking. It turns its head toward the women. Its handler loosens the leash slightly. The dog begins to move forward. The women shrink back. One covers her face. Another whispers a prayer. The dog reaches the fence. It sniffs the air. Then it does something completely unexpected. It pushes its nose through the wire and licks the trembling hand of the nearest woman. She gasps, not in pain, in shock, because the dog is not attacking. It is simply being a dog. And in that single moment, everything the women had been taught begins to crumble. By May 1945, Nazi Germany had been defeated. Adolf Hitler was dead. Berlin had fallen to the Soviet army. German forces were surrendering across Europe. The war that had consumed the continent for 6 years was finally ending. But for millions of people, the chaos was just beginning. Across Germany, roads were filled with refugees fleeing the fighting. Cities lay in ruins from years of bombing. Entire regions had no food, no water, no electricity. The country had been torn apart from every direction. In the final weeks of the war, Allied armies, American, British, Canadian, and French, swept through western and southern Germany. They liberated concentration camps. They captured German soldiers by the thousands. And they encountered something they had not fully expected. Thousands of women in military uniforms. These were not combat soldiers. They were auxiliary personnel, Helferinnen, as they were called. Helpers. They had worked as nurses in field hospitals, as telephone operators in command centers, as clerks typing reports and filing documents. Some operated searchlights to help spot enemy aircraft. Others worked in supply depots or cooked meals for troops. Under Nazi law, women were not allowed to serve in combat roles. But the German military needed workers, and as the war dragged on and more men were sent to the front lines, women were recruited to fill support positions. By 1945, hundreds of thousands of German women had served in these roles. And now, as Germany collapsed, they found themselves prisoners of war. The Allied forces processed them just like any other military captives. They were detained, questioned, and moved to holding camps. Some camps were set up in old schools or warehouses. Others were nothing more than open fields surrounded by barbed wire fences and guard towers. Life in these camps was uncertain. The women did not know how long they would be held. They did not know if they would be punished. And they did not know what the Allied soldiers would do to them. But there was something else that terrified them even more than the soldiers. Tisser, dogs military. Working dogs had been used throughout World War II by nearly every army involved in the conflict. The Americans, British, and Soviets all trained dogs for various tasks. Some were messenger dogs, carrying orders across battlefields when radios failed. Others were search and rescue dogs, finding wounded soldiers in rubble or forests. Many were sentry dogs, trained to guard camps, patrol perimeters, and alert handlers to intruders. German Shepherds were the most common breed. They were intelligent, loyal, and powerful. Dobermans were also popular, especially in the Pacific Theater. These dogs were not pets. They were working animals with specific jobs. But they were not the vicious attack beasts that Nazi propaganda had described. For years, German civilians and military personnel had been fed stories about the enemy. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's propaganda minister, made sure of that. Radio broadcasts, newspapers, and newsreels painted terrifying pictures of what would happen if Germany lost the war. The Allies were described as brutal invaders who would show no mercy. Soviet soldiers were called barbarians. American and British forces were portrayed as vengeful and cruel. And their dogs. The propaganda claimed they were weapons, trained to tear people apart, to hunt down prisoners, to punish anyone who resisted. German women serving near the front lines heard these stories constantly. They were told that if they were captured, the dogs would be set loose on them, that the animals were starved and trained to attack on command. None of it was true, but the women had no way of knowing that. So when Allied forces captured German positions and the women saw soldiers approaching with dogs on leashes, their fear was immediate and overwhelming. They had been taught to expect violence. They believed the dogs were dangerous, and they had no reason to think otherwise. When they were marched into prisoner camps and saw the dogs patrolling the fences, their terror only grew. The dogs barked. They paced back and forth. They watched the prisoners with alert, focused eyes. To the women, it looked like the dogs were waiting for orders, waiting for permission to attack. They did not realize the truth. These dogs were simply doing their jobs, guarding the camp, keeping watch, following their handlers' commands, and many of them, despite their training, were still just dogs. Dogs that had once been puppies. Dogs that liked to play. Dogs that responded to kindness and gentle voices. The women would soon discover this for themselves. The women's perspective, to understand the depth of their fear, you have to understand what these women had already been through. Many of them had spent years working in conditions that grew worse with each passing month. They had lived through Allied bombing raids that destroyed entire cities in a single night. They had worked in freezing bunkers with little food and less sleep. They had watched the German army retreat again and again, knowing that defeat was coming, and through it all, they had been told the same message over and over. If the enemy captures you, you will suffer. The propaganda was relentless. Posters showed snarling dogs with bared teeth. Radio broadcasts described prisoners being mauled by attack animals. Soldiers returning from the front repeated rumors they had heard. Stories that grew more horrifying with each retelling. The women believed these stories because they had no reason to doubt them. They had never met an American or British soldier. They had never seen how Allied forces actually treated prisoners. All they knew was what they had been told by their own government. So when they were captured and saw the dogs, their minds filled with images of the worst possible outcomes. Some of the women froze completely. They stood still, afraid that any movement might trigger an attack. Others tried to make themselves as small as possible, crouching down or pressing against walls and fences. A few cried silently. Some prayed. One woman later recalled that she kept her eyes closed, convinced that if she could not see the dogs, maybe they would not see her. The fear was not just about physical pain. It was about helplessness. These women had already lost everything. Their country was destroyed. Many of their homes were gone. Families were scattered or dead. They had no control over what happened to them next. And now they were, trapped in a camp surrounded by animals they believed were trained to hurt them. It was a specific kind of terror. Not the sudden shock of an explosion or the panic of being shot at, but the slow, constant dread of waiting for something terrible to happen. They watched the dogs constantly. Every bark made them flinch. Every time a dog moved closer to the fence, they held their breath. The handlers noticed. Some of them tried to reassure the women, speaking in calm voices or keeping the dogs at a distance. But words meant little when fear ran that deep. The women could not imagine that these animals might be harmless. They could not picture a scenario where a military dog would do anything other than attack. They had been taught that dogs were weapons, and weapons only had one purpose. So they waited, terrified for the inevitable moment, when the dogs would be unleashed. What they did not expect was that the dogs had no interest in hurting them. What they could not have imagined was that one of those dogs would approach them not with aggression but with simple, innocent curiosity. The dogs and their handlers. The military working dogs in Allied camps were carefully trained animals with specific jobs to do. They were not attack dogs in the way the German women imagined. Most of them had been trained for sentry duty, to patrol camp perimeters, alert their handlers to unusual activity, and help maintain security. Some were trained to detect intruders or track escapees, but very few were trained to attack on command. The training process was rigorous, but not cruel. Handlers worked with their dogs for months, building trust and obedience. The dogs learned commands in English or French. They learned to walk on a leash without pulling. They learned to sit, stay, and alert when they sensed something unusual. But underneath the training, they were still dogs. They had personalities. Some were playful and energetic. Others were calm and serious. A few were friendly to everyone they met. Some bonded intensely with their handlers and were cautious around strangers. The handlers knew their dogs well. They fed them, exercised them, and cared for them like partners. Many soldiers grew deeply attached to their animals. In the chaos and brutality of war, the dogs represented something pure: loyalty without politics, companionship without judgment. When the handlers brought their dogs into prisoner camps, they were there to work. The dogs helped keep order. They discouraged escape attempts simply by being present. Their sharp senses could detect things humans might miss. But the handlers also noticed something else. They saw how terrified the German women were. They saw them shrinking back, covering their faces, trembling at the sight of the dogs. At first, some handlers found it confusing. Their dogs were well behaved. They had never attacked a prisoner. They had never been ordered to. Then they realized the women had been fed lies. They genuinely believed the dogs were dangerous. One American handler later recalled watching a group of women press themselves against a fence when his German Shepherd, a dog named Rex, walked past. Rex was one of the gentlest dogs in the unit. Off duty, he loved to play fetch and would roll over for belly rubs. But the women saw only his size, his alertness, his military bearing. The handler decided to try something. He brought Rex closer to the fence, keeping him on a short leash. He spoke to the women in slow, simple German. "Gut Hund, good dog. No bite." The women did not believe him, but they watched. Rex sniffed the air. His tail wagged slightly. He was curious. One of the women had her hand resting on the bottom wire of the fence. She had not realized it. She was focused on Rex's face, trying to read his intentions. Rex leaned forward and licked her fingers. She gasped and pulled her hand back. But then she paused. She looked at her hand. Then at the dog. Rex's tail wagged again. The handler smiled. He reached down and patted Rex on the head. The dog leaned into the touch, calm and content. The woman stared. This was not the behavior of a weapon. This was not a trained killer. This was just a dog, being a dog. Slowly, carefully, she extended her hand again. This time, she let Rex sniff it. He licked her fingers once more, then sat down, looking pleased with himself. The handler saw the woman's expression change. The terror was still there, but now there was something else. Confusion, curiosity, the beginning of understanding. Other handlers began to notice similar moments. Dogs that approached the fence out of curiosity. Women who flinched, then realized nothing bad was happening. Small interactions that slowly dismantled years of propaganda. The dogs did not know they were doing anything special. They were simply being themselves. But in doing so, they accomplished something the soldiers could not. They proved that not everything the women had been told was true. The breakthrough moment did not happen all at once. It happened in small steps, dog by dog, woman by woman. In one camp near Munich, a Doberman named Duke became the first to break through the wall of fear. Duke was a patrol dog, lean and alert, with dark fur and sharp eyes. To the German women watching him pace the perimeter, he looked exactly like the attack dogs they had been warned about. But Duke had a habit his handler could never quite train out of him. Whenever he passed someone sitting still, he had to investigate. Not aggressively, just curiously. One afternoon, Duke was on his routine patrol when he noticed a young woman sitting alone near the fence. She was staring at the ground, her arms wrapped around her knees, trying to make herself invisible. Duke stopped. His handler felt the leash go slack. He looked down at the dog, then at the woman, and decided to see what would happen. He gave Duke a few extra feet of leash. The dog approached slowly. The woman did not move. She had seen him coming, but was too frightened to react. Duke reached the fence. He sniffed the wire. Then he pushed his nose through a gap and touched the woman's shoe. She flinched but did not pull away. She was frozen. Duke sniffed her shoe again. Then, satisfied, he licked her ankle. The woman's eyes went wide. She looked down at the dog. He was not snarling. He was not baring his teeth. His tail was even wagging slightly. She slowly, cautiously, reached out one hand. Duke sniffed it. Then he licked her palm. The woman let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like hours. She looked up at Duke's handler, confusion written all over her face. The handler nodded. "Good dog," he said in English. Then, in broken German, "Keine Angst," no afraid. The woman nodded slowly, still processing what had just happened. Duke's tail wagged a little harder. He licked her hand one more time, then returned to his handler's side, ready to continue the patrol. The woman sat there for a long moment, staring at her hand. Then she started to cry, not from fear this time, but from relief. Word of these encounters spread quietly through the camp. One woman whispered to another, "The dog licked my hand. It did not bite me." Another said, "I thought it would attack, but it just sniffed me and walked away." Slowly, cautiously, the women began to change their behavior around the dogs. Instead of turning away or covering their faces, they started to watch. They observed how the dogs interacted with their handlers, sitting calmly, wagging tails, responding to gentle commands. They noticed that the dogs were fed regular meals, just like the prisoners. They saw handlers patting their dogs, scratching behind their ears, speaking to them in soft voices. These were not the behaviors of people controlling weapons. These were the behaviors of people caring for animals. One afternoon, a German Shepherd named Max was resting near the fence after a long patrol. His handler had given him water and was sitting beside him, relaxing in the shade. A small group of women sat a few feet away on the other side of the fence. They had been watching Max for several minutes. One of them, a former nurse named Greta, gathered her courage. She made a soft clicking sound with her tongue, the kind of sound people use to call a friendly dog. Max's ears perked up. He lifted his head and looked at her. Greta froze, suddenly terrified that she had made a mistake. But Max simply stood up, stretched, and walked over to the fence. He sat down directly across from her and tilted his head, as if asking, "What do you want?" Greta's heart pounded, but she extended her hand through the wire. Max sniffed it carefully. Then he licked her fingers. Greta smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it was real. The other women watched in amazement. One of them reached out too. Max sniffed her hand and gave it a gentle lick as well. Within minutes, several women were sitting by the fence, letting Max sniff and lick their hands. The dog seemed perfectly content, his tail wagging steadily. Max's handler watched from a few feet away. He did not interfere. He understood what was happening. These women were learning that they had been lied to, that the enemy they had been taught to fear was not as monstrous as they had been told, and that even in a prison camp, surrounded by guards and barbed wire, small moments of kindness were still possible. The transformation was not complete. The women were still prisoners. They were still uncertain about their futures, and they were still processing the trauma of the war. But in that moment, with a dog's wet nose pressing against their hands, they felt something they had not felt in a long time. They felt safe. In the days and weeks that followed, the relationship between the women and the dogs continued to evolve. The women stopped flinching every time a dog walked past. They no longer pressed themselves against walls or covered their faces in fear. Some even began to look forward to the moments when the patrol dogs came near the fence. The handlers noticed the change. A few of them started allowing their dogs to spend extra time near the prisoners during rest breaks. They saw how the interactions seemed to calm the women, how a simple moment with a dog could ease the tension that hung heavy over the camp. One handler, a British corporal named James Whitmore, brought his German Shepherd, Lady, to the fence every afternoon after patrol. Lady was gentle and patient, and the women quickly grew fond of her. They would sit quietly, reaching through the wire to stroke her fur while she sat calmly, enjoying the attention. For the women, these moments became small pockets of normalcy in an otherwise uncertain existence. The dogs did not care about politics. They did not care about uniforms or nations or who had won the war. They simply responded to kindness with kindness. It was a lesson the women desperately needed. Many of them had spent years being told that the world outside Germany was filled with enemies who wanted to destroy them. Now they were learning that reality was far more complicated. The soldiers guarding them were not monsters. The dogs were not weapons, and perhaps, just perhaps, the future was not as hopeless as they had feared. The psychological impact was subtle but significant. Women who had been silent and withdrawn began to talk to each other more. Some even started speaking to the guards in broken English, asking simple questions or offering small gestures of cooperation. The dogs had become an unexpected bridge between captors and captives. By the summer of 1945, most of the German women held in Allied camps were gradually released. The screening process determined that the majority of them had served only in non-combat support roles and were not members of the Nazi Party. They were given basic supplies and told they could return home, or what remained of it. Germany was in ruins. Cities were destroyed. Families were scattered. The economy had collapsed. But the women were free, and they were alive. Some of them carried memories of their time in the camps that would stay with them forever. And surprisingly, many of those memories involved the dogs. In later interviews and memoirs, several former prisoners mentioned the animals specifically. One woman wrote about how she had been convinced she would be killed, but then a dog licked her hand and everything changed. Another described how watching the handlers care for their dogs helped her realize that not all soldiers were cruel. These were small moments in the grand scope of World War II. They did not change the outcome of battles. They did not shift political policies. But for the women who experienced them, they were transformative. The dogs had done something the propaganda could never undo. They had shown the women that fear based on lies could be broken by simple truth. That even in the darkest circumstances, kindness could still exist. The handlers, too, carried these memories. Several wrote in letters home about the German women who had been so terrified of their dogs. Some expressed surprise at how deeply the propaganda had worked. Others felt a strange kind of sadness, realizing how much fear had been deliberately planted in people's minds. As for the dogs themselves, they returned to their duties, unaware of the impact they had made. Some were eventually retired and adopted by their handlers. Others continued serving in military roles for years. But in that brief moment in 1945, in a prisoner camp somewhere in Germany, they had served a purpose no one had trained them for. They had reminded people that underneath all the uniforms, all the flags, and all the hatred, there was still something shared and simple. The universal language of a wagging tail and a gentle touch. And sometimes, in the aftermath of war, that was exactly what people needed most. War teaches people to see the world in absolutes. Friend or enemy, right or wrong, safe or dangerous. But the story of these German women and the dogs reveals something more complicated and more human. It shows how easily fear can be manufactured, how propaganda can twist reality so completely that people become terrified of things that were never truly dangerous, and how a single moment of unexpected kindness can begin to undo years of carefully constructed lies. The women who covered their faces and pressed themselves against fences were not foolish. They were reacting to information they had been given by people they had been taught to trust. They had no way of knowing the truth. They had no reason to doubt what they had been told. But the dogs had no agenda. They had not been trained to lie or manipulate. They simply responded to the world as they found it, with curiosity, with affection, with the straightforward honesty that only animals possess. And in doing so, they accomplished something remarkable. They showed the women that not everything they had feared was real, that the enemy they had been taught to hate was capable of gentleness, that even in captivity, surrounded by guards and barbed wire, there were still moments of simple, uncomplicated kindness. This was not forgiveness. It was not reconciliation. The horrors of the war could not be erased by a dog licking someone's hand. But it was a beginning. It was a crack in the wall of fear and hatred that had been built up over years of propaganda. It was a reminder that beneath the uniforms and the flags and the rhetoric, people and animals were still capable of basic decency. History often remembers the battles, the generals, the political decisions, but it is these small, quiet moments that reveal the deeper truths about what war does to people. Not just the physical destruction, but the psychological damage, the fear that gets planted, the lies that get believed, the humanity that gets buried, and the slow, difficult process of rediscovering it. The women who felt a dog's tongue on their trembling hands learned something that no speech or treaty could have taught them. They learned that the world was more complicated than they had been told, that kindness could exist even in the strangest places, and that sometimes the bridge between enemy and friend could be as simple as a wagging tail. That lesson did not erase the past, but it offered something just as important. It offered hope for the future.